화사에 놔두고 왔다. 아니면 선생님 내일은. 아 진짜요? 맞네, 만유쌤도 안 계시죠? 아 그쵸. 그러면 끝나고 과세에서 받아가셔도 괜찮으세요? 알겠습니다. 네네.
네. 되게 클레버한 거죠. 이건 클레버. 와, 이거 할수 있는 줄 몰랐어.
Hi. Hello. Hello. I'll put the pianist on the wall somewhere so I can read. What does that say? That's it. Right, I'll use that. Thank you. Who wants to do that's right. Oh, sorry. What is I know, right? I perform by reaching the back of the auditorium with my voice. I'm not a microphone person. I'm sorry. I will be as loud as I can. I must want some engine. Sorry. Sorry about that. 1 minute. Oh, that's better. That's better. Yeah.
Sure. Clip. There it is. Perfect. Thank you.
네, 강의. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Solji Han, and I'm an assistant professor of English here at KNU. It's a great pleasure to welcome you all to the second talk in a series by Professor Gabriel Egan, who is joining us for a set of insightful and meaningful discussions on the convergence of digital methodologies and humanities scholarship. I know Professor Egan needs little introduction at this point, as many of you are already familiar with him from previous events. However, I will briefly reintroduce him for those who may be joining us for the first time. So Professor Gabriel Egan is a professor of Shakespeare Studies and director of the Center for Textual Studies at the Montfort University. He's one of the 4 general editors of the New Oxford Shakespeare, with forthcoming work on the complete alternative versions. Professor Egan has led several major research projects, including an AHRC-funded study on Shakespeare's early editions and a Royal Society APEX grant using information theory to analyze textual variation. His work combines literary scholarship with computational methods, offering insights into authorship, adaptation, and textual transmission. Today's talk is titled Our Changing Sense of What Authorship Is in the Light of Literary Study, Literary Theory, and Computational Stylistics. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Gabriel Egan.
Thank you. Thank you for coming again to this talk. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you for the generous introduction, Professor Han. The author of a text is the person who wrote the words. This simple proposition has some interesting complications I want to think through today and tease out. And as a starting point, I think we need to clarify what we mean by the verb wrote, or the verb to write. If I approach a text in this room, and there's usually one on a wall giving us instructions about fire drills, but you don't have that. But if I approach this text in the room and I copy it, looks to me like it says Kyungpook National University Humanities. Yeah, if I start to copy this text, you could say that I wrote it. I have done some writing. But that is not what we usually mean when we say that an author has written a text. And the problem is that in English we use the same verb, to write, for the act of inscribing on a piece of paper or typing on a computer some words, and we use that same verb, to write, for the mental act of selecting a sequence of words to inscribe or type. When we are discussing the plays of Shakespeare's time, my area of expertise, this can cause considerable confusion, because in many cases we have a surviving document, a manuscript, a handwritten hand script to write. We often have a manuscript containing the words chosen by one man and written down by another man. For instance, the manuscript of the document called A Game at Chess was inscribed by the professional scribe or scrivener, copyist, Ralph Crane, but he was merely copying out the words chosen by the dramatist Thomas Middleton. So for the purposes of this talk, let's put aside all those cases where one writer copies down the words chosen by another. Let's use the verb to write to mean only the act of choosing the words. If we do that, we can simply say that the author is the person who chooses the words. But there are still then some ambiguities to clarify. What does it mean to choose words? All the words I've used so far in this talk are words that I first heard other people using. I am merely reusing their words by selecting them from the set of all the words I know, my vocabulary. We could refine our definition and say that an author of a text chooses not the words, since those words are given by the language itself, but rather the author chooses a particular order in which to place a sequence of words. A particular ordering of selected words chosen by an author becomes unique as more words are selected. By unique, I mean that no one has previously put those words in that order. At what point does a selection of words become unique in this sense? Google's index of all the words on all the websites of the World Wide Web is not a complete record of all the sentences ever written, but it does include around 40 million books and virtually all the websites. So it comes close to being a complete record. If we ask Google search to find the phrase, the order of words chosen by, in inverted commas, so we get only that sequence and nothing else, then it has existing samples in its index. I hope that's on the screen. Yeah, whoops, no, wanted the, yeah. So that sequence, quotation marks mean we get only that string of words in that order. And Google has examples of other people using that sentence, or that select phrase, or that selection of words. But if we expand that 6-word phrase into a 7-word, the order of words chosen by Anne, it becomes unique. Google has no examples of anybody before me putting those words in that order, in the hundreds of billions of pages that it has indexed. A selection of common words does not need to be very long, here just 7 words, before it becomes a unique utterance, one that existed existed before. Of course, not every 7-word selection or longer is necessarily unique. The first 9 words of this talk were, the author of a text is the person who. And Google has plenty of examples of other writers using that exact selection of words. Although not many, the selection is quite rare. I'll come back to this point later when considering research by scholars who think that rare selections of words are the best evidence for discovering who is the author of a text when that information is not available to us from other means. But for now, let us ground our definition of authorship in this fact of being the creator of a unique selection, an ordered sequence of words. The changing sense of authorship in my title that I want to track in this talk is, at its simplest, a decline in the interest by scholars in the human being whom we call the author, and a shift in scholars' attention away from that person onto the text that the author creates and the readers of that text. A significant moment in that shift was the publication of the influential essay, The Intentional Fallacy, by W.K. Wimsatt and M.C. Beardsley in 1946. I've shown that too early, let me go back. Before Wimsatt and Beardsley's essay was published, one strongly prevailing belief in literary scholarship was that the best way to make sense of a literary work is by seeking to understand what the author intended to achieve by that work, what he wanted to say and how he wanted to say it, and then to judge whether the work lives up to that intention. Wimsatt and Beardsley argued that we simply cannot know the author's intention. It is unavailable to us. All we have is the writing, and our attention should be intensely focused on that. The focus then is on the writing, not the writer. After all, knowledge of the writing is available to everyone. As Wimsatt and Beardsley put it, the paradox is only verbal, only superficial, that what is, one, internal to the writing is also public. It is discovered through the semantics and syntax of a poem, through our habitual knowledge of the language, through grammars, dictionaries, and all the literature which is the source of dictionaries, in general through all that makes a language and culture. So what's internal to the text, the words on the page, are in fact public, whereas what is external, all the other things about the author, the external facts, are actually private or idiosyncratic. They're not part of the work as a linguistic fact. It consists of revelations in journals, for example, or letters or reported conversations about how or why the poet wrote the poem, to what lady, sitting on what lawn, or at the death of what friend or brother. Before Wimsatt and Beardsley's essay, the dominant 19th century approach to literary criticism had been to focus on the life and the experiences of the author as the way to understand what he had written. Wimsatt and Beardsley rejected this biographical approach on the grounds that the poem is not the author's. By poem, they mean literary texts in general. The poem belongs to the public. It is embodied in language, the peculiar possession of the public. And it is about the human being, any human being, an object of public knowledge. Wimsatt and Beardsley focused attention on what actually got written rather than on the person who wrote it. They remarked that critical inquiries are not settled by consulting the oracle, meaning the author, but by consulting the writing. It has been noticed that this approach to literary scholarship that Wimsatt and Beardsley advocated, broadly the approach we call the new criticism, that was dominant in the Anglophone world between the end of the Second World War and the 1970s. This approach was conducive to teaching English literature in a greatly expanded university sector in America and in Great Britain, without incurring great cost. If all one needs to do literary criticism is the skill of close reading and a copy of the poem, institutions that lack vast libraries of secondary materials are not at a great disadvantage compared to their older and better funded rivals. A cynical person would say that the theory of new criticism that Wimsatt and Beardsley championed was successful not only for its own inherent merits as a set of ideas, but also because it was well suited to the prevailing economic realities of teaching English literature at universities. Two essays published in French in the late 1960s had at least as large an effect as Wimsatt and Beardsley, their essay. And that effect has endured with, and this is my key assertion for the talk, with long-running harmful consequences for discussions of authorship in literary studies. Yeah, that's them. Those two essays are Roland Barthes' La mort d'Arthur, The Death of the Author, published in 1968, and Michel Foucault's responding, Qu'est-ce qu'un auteur? What is an author? Published in 1969. Although the new critics, such as Wimsatt and Beardsley, thought that the life and intentions of the author were unimportant for understanding what the author wrote, they nonetheless accepted that authors are the main determinants or causes of what gets written. That is, authors have authority over their writing. That was the orthodoxy that Roland Barthes and Michel Foucault challenged and overturned. In its place, they established the idea that writers do not so much as choose their words that they write, they rather have those words chosen for them by the world they live in and the place they occupy within that world. Writers in this view express themselves in writing that is largely shaped by their class and their race and their political ideologies, their sexual orientations, and so on. Moreover, the literary genre they choose to write in is as important as their own thoughts in shaping what they write. I began talking today with some reflections on language that actually help us understand where Barthes and Foucault's ideas came from. That is, the idea that language is a shared social phenomenon, and every word I've spoken to you today is a word that I have heard before, and hopefully that you have heard before too. So that in one sense, I cannot say anything original. I am making my own selection of words, of course, but many of my phrases, many of my ideas are already familiar to you. there is, in this view, no getting away from what has been said previously, no chance for true originality, other than in remixing what has gone before. For Barthes, this meant that there simply could not be any originality in writing. He wrote in The Death of the Author that, this is a famous quotation, "The text is a tissue of quotations drawn from the innumerable centers of culture." Foucault's examination of authorship in What is an Author brought him to make a useful, I'm not entirely against Foucault, this bit is useful, that he made a useful distinction between different kinds of ownership of different kinds of writing. Somebody wrote those words on the sign. Somebody wrote them, but that person isn't really the author of those words because they were not written on behalf of that person. They're addressed to us as readers, but they come from the university. They come from a corporation or a body that is not one person. This is the contract for the rental car that I used to drive here from Seoul. It has been written by somebody in a certain language. But they speak not with the authority of themselves as an author, they speak with the authority of the corporation that rented the car to me. Documents such as these, this one and this one, they are writing, but they do not really have an author. The individual concerns the creativity of the person who happened to do the writing is not the point of the writing. Instead of using the term authorship, Foucault found it more helpful to refer to the author function, which some discourses, such as literary novels and poems, do have. They have an author, but other discourses, such as legal contracts, notices, they do not. According to Foucault, and I should point out that I think he was wrong historically, as a matter of historical fact, this claim is false. According to Foucault, before the 17th century, literary texts did not need to be ascribed an author, since their ancientness, imagined or real, was regarded as sufficient guarantee of their status. By contrast, according to Foucault, scientific texts in the Middle Ages did need the name of an ancient author, as in such formulations as Hippocrates said or Pliny recounts. In the 17th and 18th centuries, again, according to Foucault, a reversal took place and scientific texts came to be valued not because of the author's status as an authority, but rather for what they objectively showed to be the case. Scientific texts were validated by the demonstrable, verifiable truth within them, not by who wrote them. So that's a reversal. And similarly, at the same time, literary texts came to be accepted only when endowed with the author function. That's quoting Foucault. We now ask of each poetic or fictional text, where does it come from? Who wrote it? When? Under what circumstances? Or beginning with what design? It's hard to overstate the influence of Barthes and Foucault's lasting influence within literary studies in the Anglophone world that I come from. I genuinely don't know about their effect here. There have been powerful demonstrations that they were wrong on the historical facts of how authorship has been understood across the centuries. But these refutations, these people proving that Barthes and particularly Foucault are wrong, have not made much difference to the reception of their ideas. Brian Vickers provided an exceptionally well-supported response in his book, Shakespeare Co-Author, about the co-authorship of Shakespeare's plays. Confounding Foucault's claim that from the 17th to the 18th century onwards, scientific texts were effectively anonymous, had become anonymous. Vickers pointed out that Johannes Kepler, Galileo Galilei, René Descartes, Isaac Newton, and others were all known to their contemporaries as scientific authors. Likewise, Foucault's claim that before then, all poetic texts were effectively anonymous is in complete ignorance of the classical world's concept of the author. Far from being anonymously published, a great many of the books published in England in the period 1475, when the first printed books appear, to 1641, have dedications in which their named authors specifically thank their named patrons. And crucially, as Vickers showed, authors cared about their reputations and had done for centuries. It was true in the classical world, and it was true in Shakespeare's time, that authors cared about plagiarism, someone copying their words and passing them off as their own. This was recognized. This was despised, detested. They cared about who had written what. So Foucault is wrong on that historical point. Being wrong doesn't stop you being influential. This is a very influential book that builds upon those ideas. Textual Intercourse, 1997. It's about the practice of collaborative playwriting. What happens when two or more men, they're always men, work together writing a play in Shakespeare's time. By Geoffrey Maston, who took it as proven that Foucault was right. The texts do not automatically have an author by virtue of being texts, but rather the author, this is Maston, the author has a particular point of emergence as a cultural fiction around 100 years after Shakespeare's time. So round about the year 1700, said Maston, we invented the notion of an author. Maston also assumed that G.E. Bentley, the great theatre historian, was right, that about half of all the plays in Shakespeare's time were written as collaborations of two or more authors. That claim of Bentley's has been widely reproduced. You'll find it in books by people like Helen Hirschfeld, Gordon MacMullen, Philip Maguire, Al Brunmuller, Brian Vickers, and others. In fact, it's a substantial overstatement. Recent careful counting by Paul Brown has shown that not a half, but only a quarter of all plays of Shakespeare's time were co-authored. For Maston, this author, the fact that plays were co-written only made even more strong Foucault's point about particular authors not being the important sources of meaning in a text. According to Maston, and his title, Textual Intercourse, was designed to make this point. When two writers worked together, they mixed and blended their styles, influencing one another, so that nothing remained of any of the distinctive personal style that each writer might have had. For Maston, this meant that even if we could distinguish the particular writing style of one author, and he was skeptical we could even do that, but even if we could, he says, it would be in any case impossible to disentangle the style of two writers who had worked together on a play. In fact, according to Maston, that was the whole point of drama. It was, as he says, an artistic form designed to eliminate individual creativity and privilege the collaborative creation by an ensemble of artists. This is Maston, quote, I'm quoting Maston, the collaborative project in the theatre was predicated on erasing the perception of any differences that might have existed for whatever reason between collaborating parts. The necessity to de-emphasize the author, to decenter the author, had by the end of the 20th century become a literary axiom in my field, at least. In the Anglophone world, people took all of these things to be so true you didn't have to even prove it. It was just an axiom, it was a given, as we say. And it moved from literary studies into adjacent fields. Theatre historians, for example, began to look for new ways to organize the study of plays without treating authors as the central points of authority from which writing emanates. Accepting Barthes and Foucault's point about the relative unimportance of authors, theatre historians needed a new organizing principle around which to build their narratives. And they found that principle in the idea that each theatre company, each troupe, as we say, of Shakespeare's time, had its own distinctive style. In fact, they said that each theatre company, each collective of actors, could be said to have its own canon, in the sense that dramatists were required to write their works to suit the style of that company. This assumption that that is true, that authors were made to fit the style of the company, the theatre company they were writing for, generated a whole collection of new book-length studies of the style of each theatre company. So we have books about the Queen's Men's Company, the Admiral's Men's Company, the Children of the Queen's Revels Company, and Strangers' Men. I haven't time to go into it now, but one of the people whose scholarship I shall be showing has also disproved that point about theatre company style. There was no such thing as the style of a theatre company. They didn't have distinctive styles. Getting back to authors, today's most celebrated of all theatre historians working on the plays of Shakespeare's time, Tiffany Stern, has also sought to decenter the author by considering the many ways in which the scripts used in performance were beyond the direct control of individual dramatists. In Tiffany Stern's model of theatrical production, we shouldn't think of an individual manuscript that was authorized and licensed as being the source of the authority for what got performed. Rather, according to Tiffany Stern, we should think of all the other documents used to make a play happen on stage. The things she calls actors' parts, which are all the speeches for one character written out on a separate piece of paper from which actors learned their lines. The songs written out on separate pieces of paper sent off to a composer to be set to music. Again, on separate pieces of paper were the prologues and epilogues that were reused in different plays. She's quite right, the same prologue or epilogue could be used to precede or follow multiple plays. And she also says that when a document is read on stage, when a character has to read something, those words existed as a separate document. They were not in the official manuscript of the play. They were all these documents, they were all the play, but they circulated beyond the bounds of the authorized manuscript. The result is that we must consider a play not as a unified and coherent original creation, but rather what she calls a patchwork compilation, forever being reworked. Oh, that was a list of all the books about playing companies I mentioned earlier. There's been in the last 20 years, a whole flurry of books about the style of individual playing companies. That's the quotation I wanted to show, though, Tiffany Stern, talking about the play not being a single document, but this dispersed authority. She says, the suggestion then, this is her suggestion, is that a play is a collection of fragments taken from elsewhere and loosely held together. There was something patch-like in the very way a play was written in the first place. The very method of creating a play seems to be somehow patchy. There was a sense at the time that plays were not whole artworks in the way that poems were. Plays had the bit, the fragment, the patch in their very natures. According to Stern, her method, quote, deconstructs the text along certain lines, and then up to a certain point, decenters it, de-authors it. This has been a very popular approach to thinking of drama in Shakespeare's time. And I think it's been popular because it reconciles the contradiction between what we know from theatre historical documents, which were indeed multiple. The play did exist in multiple textual forms. But you can reconcile that notion of dispersed authority with the theories of Barthes and Foucault via Stern's notion of the patchwork, the collection that only taken together forms the play, that somehow the play has been torn into parts. This is really, I would say, a version of the postmodern dispersal of authority. I think a broad spectrum of Shakespeare scholars have felt a desire, perhaps not even fully consciously, for what Stern says about documents to be true, because it appeals to current orthodoxies in English studies. These orthodoxies that I say have arisen because in Anglo-American literary criticism, the dissemination and wide acceptance of ideas from Roland Barthes and Foucault from high French theory has been almost total. I say, against all of that, these approaches to plays in Shakespeare's time are grounded in two central fallacies, two falsehoods we should address. The first is the falsehood that in recopying in different manuscripts the parts of a play, that this somehow dispersed the authority of the author, so the play became what Sterne calls a patchwork of textual fragments that only loosely derive their authority from the intentions of the author. What Sterne has overlooked is the power of the state censor. In England, plays had to be censored, had to be authorized by the censor called the Master of the Revels. And he, there was always a he, required the play to be in a single manuscript. Plays were indeed sometimes revised. People made changes to plays. But that was not done routinely. That was unusual, and it was almost never done more than once. Plays were changed, but when you made a change to a play, you had to resubmit it to the state censor to be authorized again. The play, however dispersed it was in the theatre, had to come together as a single manuscript for a single man to read and approve. And this continued in England until 1968. In my lifetime, the state censor controlled what was allowed to be performed. Contrary to Sterne's claims, we have strong evidence that actors performed only what was in that licensed script. They did not dare depart from it. They knew it was dangerous to depart from the licensed script. They couldn't change the words of the play as they felt like. Now, of course, the difference between Sterne's view and mine is a matter of emphasis, a matter of how you interpret theatre historical evidence. The second fallacy about authorship is the one arising, I say, from Roland Barthes and Michel Foucault's influential view that in the process of writing, the individual choices of the author are not really present at all. That is, in Barthes' claim, all the author does is remix materials from his own time and from culture. That is, in Foucault's claim, the author does not precede the text as its originator, but rather is an effect, something we construct after the text has emerged in order to account for that text. It is these claims that Geoffrey Mastan was building upon in his influential claim that in collaborative writing, two or more authors blend their styles so that no distinctive authorial style can be detected in the resulting script. There was, in Mastan's view, which is very influential, scarcely an individual authorial signal to be detected in the first place. And after the blending of two or more such signals in co-authorship, there is no hope of quantifying the resulting style. Unlike Sterne's claim, which is a matter of judgment on theatre historical materials, that claim is empirical, it is testable, and it is false, as I hope to show. That claim that when two authors write together, they blend their styles so you can't separate them. False, I hope to convince you. The first time that a play that has strong external evidence for being written solely by Shakespeare was seriously investigated for possible co-authorship. The first time anybody thought this play by Shakespeare might in fact be a collaboration of Shakespeare and someone else happened in the middle of the 19th century, when independently Samuel Hickson and James Spedding both considered what we call the first folio text, the first edition, of the play King Henry VIII. Spedding suggested that a reader with a practiced ear, a careful reader, would perceive unaided the distinctions in style by which he assigned parts of Henry VIII to Shakespeare and parts of the same play, Henry VIII, to the dramatist John Fletcher. And he said that those less quick in perceiving the finer rhythmical effect might be more readily convinced by some counts of lines with redundant syllables at the end, what we now call feminine endings. Across Shakespeare's late plays, the ones in the last 6 or 7 years of his life, Spedding found that around 28 to 38% of verse lines have these feminine endings. an additional 11th syllable after the expected 10. And in fact, the most famous line of all in Shakespeare is a line with a feminine ending. To be or not to be, that is the question. Jun is a unstressed 11th syllable. It makes that line what we call a feminine ending. Tabulating how often the device of the feminine ending was used in each scene of Henry VIII, Spedding found a marked difference between the scenes that his own practiced ear told him were Shakespeare's, in which between 28 and 40% of lines had a feminine ending, and those that he thought already, by his own subjective judgment, were Fletcher's work, in which the rate was much higher, 50 to 70% of lines having a feminine ending. That's one feature we can detect, the feminine ending. We can pretty much all agree on that feature. But what if we could find another objective, measurable feature of the play Henry VIII that also gives different scores for the parts of the play by Shakespeare and the parts of the play allegedly by John Fletcher? And what if we, dividing the play the way that they did, Spedding and Higson, could find that those two styles were markedly different? In an incredible paper in 2009, Hugh Craig was able to do exactly that. He first collected digital texts of 27 plays by Shakespeare alone and 7 plays by Fletcher alone, what he calls sole-authored, well-attributed works, things we know for sure, or we're certain, are by those authors and nobody else. And he divided the plays, these digital texts, into the speeches by particular characters. So we had all the speeches by one character, all the speeches by another character as separate texts. And he did not use Henry VIII. He kept that away from Shakespeare. He just judged Shakespeare and Fletcher's style on other texts that he was sure were some by Shakespeare, some by Fletcher. And then Craig counted for each character in these plays how often that character uses each of a list of 40 words that Craig had devised. Those are the 40 words. He simply counted how often each one of those occurs. He'd already discovered that these 40 words are ones that Shakespeare and Fletcher had different preferences for. Some words on this list, Shakespeare used more than Fletcher, quite a lot more. Some words Fletcher used more than Shakespeare, quite a lot more. They are good words for distinguishing the style of Shakespeare and Fletcher. Counting each character's use of those 40 words gives us 40 data points for each character. And we can think of these 40 numbers as representing a single point in 40-dimensional space, if you will. We can't show 40-dimensional space. We live in a 3-dimensional universe. But there are methods called, well, principal component analysis is the key one. I haven't time to explain it, but there's a way of reducing those 40 dimensions down to 2 without losing all of the information contained in those 40 dimensions. I'll happily talk afterwards if people want to hear more about principal component analysis. It's a well-established technique. In this picture, each yellow dot represents the 2 scores for the first and second principal component, representing the preferences expressed by Shakespeare for using or avoiding each of those 40 words that Craig was counting. So yellow, Shakespeare. The blue diamonds are the same thing for Fletcher's characters. Now, we should not read too much into the fact that they separate out into 2 clouds of dots, because in fact, Craig, as I said, chose these words in order to achieve that effect. He was using words that make that happen. In this picture, Craig has drawn the centroids of these masses, so a dot here for the center of mass, connected them with a line, and then drawn a bisector line to divide the whole space into the Shakespeare part and the Fletcher part. Notice how almost all of Fletcher's characters fall on his side of the dividing line. The only exception is that one. Apart from that, all the blue dots are on one side, all the yellow dots are on the other. The truly remarkable part of Craig's study was the next step. He took 2 characters from the play Henry VIII. Remember, that play was not used to construct the yellow and blue dots. He took two characters, Cardinal Wolsey and Queen Catherine. He divided their speeches into two kinds, the ones that fall into the part of the play supposedly written by Shakespeare, and the ones that fall in the part of the play supposedly written by Fletcher, using the divisions that Spedding derived in 1850. Remember, Spedding only used evidence from feminine endings. This is a wholly new feature testing the same hypothesis. Spedding made no study of word preferences. Craig added to his scatter plot two black dots, a black circle and a black triangle, diamonds there and there. The first embodying the score for the whole of Shakespeare's part of the play, Henry VIII, and the second embodying the score for all of Fletcher's part of the play. Notice how each of these two falls distinctly into that author's half of the whole picture. Then he added the 4 points for the two characters, Cardinal Wolsey and Queen Catherine, divided into Wolsey's speeches in the Shakespeare part and Wolsey's speeches in the Fletcher part, and Catherine's speeches in the Shakespeare part and Catherine's speeches in the Fletcher part. Notice that the circular dots for Wolsey and Catherine's roles written by Shakespeare fall into the Shakespearean part of the scatter plot. The diamond-shaped dots for Wolsey and Catherine's roles written by Fletcher fall into the Fletcherian part of the scatter plot. Thus, contrary to Mastan's prediction, when co-authoring the play, Shakespeare, remember Mastan predicted that Shakespeare and Fletcher would merge their styles. Instead of that, we find that Shakespeare and Fletcher's habits persist in their collaboration, even within a single character. When the two men are writing the character of Wolsey or the character of Queen Catherine, Shakespeare gives that character a different habit of speech from the habits plural, I beg your pardon, that Fletcher gave to the same character. Now you might be wondering, if Shakespeare and Fletcher have such distinctive habits of writing, how come no one noticed before? How could Geoffrey Mastan, who knows well this play, Henry VIII, how could he not observe the differences in the two styles across this one play? The answer, I think, is in those 40 words that Craig was counting. These 40 short words are amongst the most frequently used in the English language. In fact, 5 of them are in the top 10 list of most commonly used words in all of English. That top 10 list of the words most used in English accounts for a quarter of everything written or said in English. Those words get reused very frequently. So frequently, we don't notice them. You won't spot the habits. It's very hard to see how any author could intentionally modulate how frequently they use those words. The frequency of use of these words by each author seems to be an unconscious habit. It's a matter of style, but it's not chosen. It's not intended. Until recently, studies of literary language always focused on unusual words, the ones that we do notice in writing. It was not until John Burroughs' 1987 classic book called Computation into Criticism, which if you're interested in digital humanities, I strongly recommend John Burroughs' Computation into Criticism. It's about Jane Austen's novels. Not until that book did anybody attempt to study a literary author's works by attending only to the short and highly frequent words. Part of the reason for that is they are difficult to study without computers. It is possible to manually count every one of these words. There are 2 great studies that did that. David Lake's 1975 book, The Canon of Thomas Middleton, and MacDonald P. Jackson's 1979 book, Studies in Attribution. They counted by hand, literally thousands of occurrences. But now that we have many texts in digital form, it has become feasible for any one of us to count the most frequent words and to compare these counts in one author's works to the same counts from another author's works. Even though we can make these comparisons, not everyone is convinced that the most frequent words are where the authors are most distinctive. And one reason why this approach has met resistance is not least of all it doesn't look very exciting to many people. That doesn't get literary scholars worked up. When you produce an investigation of this kind and a journalist will ask you to explain your work in simple language, they always say, tell me what are the words that Shakespeare preferred. And if you tell them the, and, in, they don't want to know. They want to know about the words they will have noticed. And you can give some examples. I mean, we do know from this kind of study that Shakespeare used the word gentle more than other writers of his time. He also used the words answer and beseech more than other people did. We can tell that he avoided certain words. He used them far less frequently than other writers. He avoids the word yes. He avoids the word sure. He avoids the word hopes. And we can make some distinctions of Shakespeare's writing using those interesting lexical words, but they don't occur very often. If you really want to tell Shakespeare's style, you don't use the rare words, you use the frequent words. And we can use these studies of style, studies like Hugh Craig's, to also explore questions of authorship attribution where they are still disputed. We still don't know exactly what Shakespeare wrote. We keep changing our minds about which plays are by Shakespeare. The New Oxford Shakespeare that I'm involved in has 43 plays that have some Shakespeare in them somewhere. We've added new plays to the canon. This is very controversial. People get very annoyed when you change the Shakespeare canon. The most vocal of all critics of the New Oxford Shakespeare is Brian Vickers, who I mentioned earlier, who has said that these methods simply cannot distinguish authorship. They don't work, he claims. So I thought it would be fun to try them on Brian Vickers' works. So I took his books and also the books of another great literary scholar of our time, who's a Shakespearean, Sir Stanley Wells. And I thought, let's simply do a count of one or two words. And of. I took 300,000 words by Brian Vickers. No, 400,000, sorry. And counted just how often he uses and of. Those are the results. And they're listed per 1,000 words. So about, there are 3 different books. So I took 3 books totaling 400,000 words by Vickers. And I know I've cheated. You should start the axis at 0, but I want you to see the pattern. So I've zoomed into one part of the picture. But they are forming a distinctive, well, you can't tell on their own, but they come together, those 3 dots. Then I did the same thing for 3 books by Stanley Wells. And they form a distinct cloud. We can say objectively that Stanley Wells uses and of somewhat more frequently than Vickers does. And then when you're playing with these tools, it's very hard not to keep trying new texts that you thought of. I've also written about 300,000 words in published books. I've got 3 books that total that amount. So I put me in there as well. And again, they form a distinct cluster. Now, I'm not making any great claim that we can distinguish anything from just 2 words, but I want to show that even with just 2 words, suggestive patterns start to emerge. We can say objectively that I use and a bit more often than Vickers does. Or indeed, slightly more often than Wells does. I use and more frequently than either of them. And we can say that I use of a bit less than either Vickers or Wells does, about 21 times per 1,000 words. Writers do indeed seem to have characteristic habits of word choice. We can repeat these experiments with words rarer than of and the results hold up. But the trouble with looking at rare words is you just don't find them very frequently. And if you use the most frequent words, you get the most data. We had a class this afternoon about what happens when you have large amounts of data, and patterns emerge that are much more unreliable if you have small amounts of data. The best place to look, I say then, for authorial style is in those most frequent words. Because I'm certain I did not choose to use and more frequently than Vickers or Wells, and to use of less frequently. I know I didn't intend that difference, but it is demonstrably present in my writing. I'm certain that Vickers and Wells do not consciously modulate their use of those words. It's almost certain that these varying rates of usage are unconscious habits of writing that vary from one person to another. And so, in a sense, I'm prepared to admit that Roland Barthes, Michel Foucault, and the post-structuralists were correct. The writers do not so much choose their words as have their words chosen for them. But it's not society, it's not the wider literary culture that is making these word choices that distinguish one writer from another. It is the writer's own unconscious minds. And likewise, in another sense, Wimsatt and Beardsley were correct in their claim that the author's intentions do not matter, or at least do not matter for distinguishing one author from another. The words that matter for distinguishing one author from another, the words that we can empirically weigh as some aspect of authorial style, are not the words that authors intend to use. They are the most common words that we use because we have to use them, because they are the very fabric of the English language. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Egan, for your great and thought-provoking presentation. We now have some time for discussions and questions. So if you have any thoughts you'd like to share or ask a question, then raise your hand and we will keep the conversation going from there.
Hi. Good question. Are there limitations? Well, there are, because sometimes authors do, not often, but sometimes they do choose words like and. There's a technique, is it called anaphora? There's a technique of concatenating clauses with and. It's characteristic of children telling your story. And we went to the park and I played with a ball and I lost the ball and my friend came, and then children make stories that way. And sometimes adult writers choose these words. They'll repeat a word strategically throughout a text. So yes, you have to be aware that sometimes what seems to be mostly unconscious is occasionally conscious. But they're very rare occurrences. And Brian Vickers, for example, has published work showing that sometimes Shakespeare is deliberately choosing his ands. True, but almost all the time he is not. So that's one of the confounding factors. The other is, don't use 2. Use 50 or 100 of the most frequent words. If you use the 100 most frequent words in English, you've got half of all language in there. Those 100 words are half of everything we say and write in the language. So you've got a large amount of data. And that's when the signal emerges from the noise. That's when we can hear what's really happening. So yeah, 2 is just a trivial demonstration. You need to use more than 2. That it works, that these methods work, is not a subjective opinion. We can test it. What we can do is say, if this works, let's take 100 plays where we know the author already. And let's pretend we don't know the author. Let's use this method to predict the author and see how often this method gives you the right prediction. So you can do an actual empirical study of how powerful this is. And it works about 85 to 90% of the time. That is, if you use this method on, say, 100 plays, and use it to predict the author, and if you have a fairly limited set of possible authors, there are certain people alive at the time who could be the author, then given those constraints, you can get to about 90% accuracy. That is 9 times out of 10, it works. Are there other limitations? Yes, choosing the set of potential authors, the candidates, is tricky. We don't have good science to know how to eliminate candidates. And I think you hinted at this in your question. Does it work across all genres, all times? And there's starting to be studies that try to test this kind of methodology on, say, 18th century novels, 20th century science fiction poems, to try all the genres. And it is the case that some genres are harder to distinguish than others. It is the case that some writers are harder to distinguish than others. A lot of these methods using the frequent words are most unreliable when trying to distinguish the writer called George Chapman from William Shakespeare. It so happens Chapman and Shakespeare are similar in their style of using these words. So yes, there are challenges. But the important point, I think, is that these are not subjective. If you do the methodology right, the results are effectively unarguable. It's science, not judgment, which I think is quite important. Thank you. Great question. Yes. Thank you. Sorry, say again. Oh, yes. Yes. Yeah. Well, to a large extent, and I realize I have been rather vulgar in my treatment of the French theorists. I've overstated my case for the purposes of argument. But largely, if I understand them correctly, and I have read everything that Barthes and Foucault published, the author's personal experience doesn't matter very much. It doesn't matter as much as the world they come from. The claim would be, people like me write like me, that you could take me away and get some other white, middle-aged, bit older person from England, and you'd get the same kind of writing. The big challenge I think this work presents to us is that's wrong. Authorship isn't like that. Authorship is individual. It's idiosyncratic. You are not like you, like me, that within a culture, across cultures, we can measure what makes things distinctive. And it's not the case that all plays that are tragedies are like tragedies. It's not the case that all men are like men. It's not the case that all heterosexuals are like none of those things are as strong a signal. The signal that emerges most strongly when we use all these different methods is personal authorship. It's you. I find that quite a charming, I'm quite pleased with that discovery. I like to be agnostic about these discoveries. It's important to try and be objective. But I must admit that rather pleases me, that the old-fashioned idea that the human individual is the strongest form of signal here is pleasing to me. But one must be careful. I did mention to some people over lunch that I had with some students that I find this all rather embarrassing to admit, because until I started to work in this field, I taught Michel Foucault and Roland Barthes as if it were true. I believed. I found their ideas, when I was a student, they were very convincing ideas, and I've been misleading students for a long time, but I hope I'm making up for that by correcting myself now. The important thing is to acknowledge one's mistakes. Thanks. Hi. That's very good, yeah. How should it influence readers? Well, readers do care about who wrote the text. Even if scholars don't care, and for a long time scholars have not cared, it is the case that biographies of authors sell very well to the general public. People care about who Jane Austen was, or who Charles Dickens was. So the biography, the life of the author, matters to many readers. So that's one justification of how readers care. But also, and one, I should say, one frequent response I have to this kind of talk in my own university, as well as others in the United Kingdom, is that scholars say they do not care who wrote the text. I say, yes, you do, even if you say you do not. Because if you say, look at this moment in this play by Shakespeare, isn't it like this moment in this play? Well, it only matters if they're both by Shakespeare. And if you draw a contrast and say, look how these other works do things differently, that's only true once you've attributed the play. That is, if you make any kind of comparisons between plays, you do care about who wrote the plays. In fact, we all care about who wrote what. You care about your writing. We should give the same credit to these authors. They would care about their writing. They did not want to be plagiarized. You don't want to be plagiarized. Human beings care what the source of the authority is. So that's one justification. As for it not being noticeable, I think that throws an interesting light on how the mind works. It's extraordinary that we would put these style habits into our writing for no good apparent reason. We don't know why this happens, but we do know objectively that it does happen. That gives work for cognitive scientists to help us understand why the mind works like that. I think we could also argue, and this is just starting to occur to me, that we might be thinking about applying these techniques to works created by artificial intelligences. What kinds of style do they have and why do they have them? Because large language models are hard to understand, but then human beings are also hard to understand. We have the same problem. How do I know what's in your mind? I talk to you. That's how I find out. So I think we have a lot invested in figuring out why these habits of style actually occur. Thanks. Is that a hand? Hi, yeah. Okay, yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Great question. I genuinely do not know the answer. I think it's the right question to explore. I think that's an unanswered piece of, we need to answer that question. We don't know. There are projects, people are trying to explore that. It is a real challenge because for the first time we've created machines that we do not understand. That's quite strange, to make something that you then can't understand. The only model we have for that is human beings, students. We don't understand, we do not know how you learned, what you learned. If we knew that, we could teach you much better than we do. Anyone who studies education, who tells you they know how learning works, needs to talk to a cognitive scientist. We have no idea how learning happens. We have an idea about how neurons make connections, how that translates into knowledge, how that translates into your knowing that Daegu is the third biggest city in Korea, is that right? Yeah, I believe I was told that. We don't know where in the brain that is. We can't find the neurons that capture that. In the same way, we can't look inside ChatGPT and say where is the knowledge that Paris is the capital of France. But we know that it does know that Paris is the capital of France. Because if you say to ChatGPT, fill in the blank, London is to England as blank is to France, ChatGPT will say Paris. We don't know where in the neurons or the weightings, they're only numbers, the weightings, we don't know where that knowledge is stored, but it is definitely knowledge. Human beings are equally mysterious, so you're absolutely right. We need to be doing that work to compare the two in relation to creativity. I think I'm probably too old to complete that work, but I do urge those of you who find that an interesting topic to pursue it, because I think it's one of the great questions of our age. Thank you. Hi, yeah.
Continuing on from that subject, like it's very controversial recently that ChatGPT has been considered a plagiarism machine.
Yeah.
And that authorship has been copied by a lot of as they use as data for training ChatGPT. So my main question is if we do find that the writing style that ChatGPT does, the literary style that ChatGPT does prefer, would this be a notch in the idea that ChatGPT could be an author by itself, or is it perhaps the collective authorship, even kind of speaks English?
Yeah. Again, you're asking the right questions to the wrong man who isn't equipped to answer them, but I think it's the right question. My reflection upon that question would be that I've spent years training a neural network on thousands of texts, literally. But his name is Paul Brown. He's a human being, but he is a neural network that I trained, and I wanted him to read everything in his area. And once he's done that, I don't know how the brain works. I know if I ask him difficult questions like what proportion of plays in Shakespeare time was poetry, he says it's only 5%, it's not 50%, and I can show you how. He's acquired it. I don't know how his mind works, he's human being. It's okay to train him on thousands of texts. Why not train him? Why should we think that your networks are biological and those are electrical? No real difference. Yeah, that's my reflection on these questions. Deserve a better answer. Sorry. Yeah. Yeah. Well, they're connected in so much as what you mean is the law of large numbers. What you just said to me there, that's first we know very much about your habits. If I had all of your life, all the essence of your life, had all the features of made, I could then start to make some assertions about your style. So it's about scale. It's about having a large enough set, because as we saw the rolling graphs, if you only do 100 rolls, you get uneven results. If you go over and over again, what emerges is unavoidable predictability. So in order to correctly reliably do this kind of work, I had to use 300,000 words by 300,000 words by force. Not 1,000 words by myself. If you use fewer words, you get less information. So it's about that idea that order and information emerges at scale. And there's a similar approach about responses. We don't know why they have to be large. The stores fall like they don't know anyway. We don't know why exactly, but we know that as we make them larger, they keep getting better. Maybe, I'm not sure if it's very large, maybe
that we're going to train large language models. Most of the model is not easy. That by allowing billions of parameters, we allow by chance the weights to occur to embody these models. And at 99% of the rates are doing nothing for us. And if we only find which is the 1% which is not, we throw away the unnecessary ones, which we need to scale for that process to emerge by chance, and then eliminate the 1, 2, or 3. But I know that's one part of the inquiry. But scale seems to be the key factor across all these studies. We think that scale, use hundreds of thousands of words, not tens of words.
This is such an engaging discussion, but we are running short on time, so we'll have to bring the session to a close. A big thank you to Professor Egan for the wonderful presentation today, and to all of you participating. Okay, this would be the end of the talk today. Thank you, Professor Egan, for your talk.